In the summer of 1913, almost nobody in Europe believed a war was coming, and one best-selling book of the era argued that war between industrial nations had become economically impossible. A year later, 17 million people were dead. Historians have since identified a specific stack of conditions that built quietly before 1914, from rising nationalism and arms races to entangling alliances and political denial. Today, we're counting down 10 of those warning signs, ranked by how closely they mirror what is happening right now. Some of these parallels will unsettle you. Others may change how you see tomorrow's headlines, starting at number 10 with the dangerous idea that modern economies have made war obsolete. In the 10th place, elite confidence that war had become economically obsolete shaped the mindset of Europe's leaders in the years before 1914. Norman Angel's arguments traveled quickly across the continent, first as Europe's optical illusion in 1909, then as the Great Illusion in 1910, and by 1913 in a fourth American edition that kept the debate alive. Angel insisted that war, even when victorious, could no longer achieve the aims for which nations fought. His claim was clear. Industrial economies were so interdependent that conquest would destroy the very wealth it sought to capture. The book sold over 2 million copies and was translated into as many as 25 languages, earning Angel the Nobel Peace Prize in 1933. Across Europe, bankers, newspaper editors, and government ministers echoed this optimism. In the summer before war broke out, editorials in London and Paris dismissed the idea that rational states would risk everything for uncertain gains. Yet Angel himself, in a 1913 letter, warned that a British-German war was extremely likely, complicating the simple story of universal belief in peace. Today, a similar argument surfaces around U.S. and China relations. Analysts point to trade volumes exceeding $700 billion and argue that the cost of conflict would be too high for either side. While economic interdependence does raise the price of confrontation, history shows it cannot override other forces: fear, prestige, ideology, or miscalculation. The illusion that commerce alone can restrain war remains a dangerous comfort, and that's why elite confidence in economic peace stands at the bottom of this countdown. Number 9. Nationalist rhetoric on the rise changes the very nature of political decision-making. In the years before 1914, newspapers and political organizations in Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg turned foreign disputes into questions of national honor and destiny. Parliamentary speeches and youth movements echoed the language of sacrifice, rivalry, and encirclement, making compromise feel like betrayal. Patriotic education and public rallies gave these ideas a mass audience, reinforcing the sense that national survival was always at stake. This atmosphere raised the political cost of backing down, locking leaders into confrontational positions even when their private interests might have favored negotiation. Today, the resurgence of nationalist language is measurable in electoral data and party platforms across multiple democracies. Pew Research's 2022 survey documents increased vote shares for right-wing populist parties in countries such as Hungary, Poland, and Italy. The VDem and populist projects track the growth of nationalist parties, showing a steady rise in both intensity and parliamentary presence from 2015 onward. In France, Germany, and Spain, parties that once hovered at the margins now command double-digit support and shape national debates around sovereignty and identity. While contemporary parties operate within modern media and electoral systems, the feedback loop between rhetoric and political action remains powerful. The language of national grievance, amplified by digital platforms, can still turn negotiation into a test of will. This direct link between words and political choices is why rising nationalist rhetoric stands above elite economic optimism in the warning signs of systemic crisis. 8th place, a return to a multipolar world marks a shift in the structure of international power that mirrors the landscape before 1914. In the years leading up to the First World War, Europe was divided among Britain, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and France, each a major actor, yet none able to impose order or reliably halt a crisis. Historians describe this as an unstable balance where overlapping ambitions and mutual suspicion made restraint difficult. No single power could dictate terms or provide a safety net when regional disputes threatened to spiral. For much of the post-Cold War era, global politics often centered on one dominant power. That pattern is now giving way. China's economic and military rise has redefined the balance, while Russia maintains its strategic weight through military and diplomatic means. India, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia increasingly pursue their own spheres of influence, acting as independent centers rather than satellites of larger blocs. Research from institutes such as SWP and Chatham House highlights the growing complexity of these relationships, noting that the distribution of power is no longer neatly divided or easily managed. Multipolarity itself does not guarantee conflict, but it multiplies the number of relationships and potential misunderstandings. When power is dispersed, local disputes, whether in Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, or the Middle East, can acquire broader consequences. The danger is not just rivalry, but the risk that actors misread intentions or red lines, turning manageable crises into wider confrontations. The lesson from history is that a crowded field of major powers raises the stakes of every diplomatic misstep. Number 7, an arms race that no side wants to stop first transforms suspicion into concrete military power and makes delay seem dangerous. In the years before 1914, Britain's and Germany's naval competition set the pace for a new era of armament. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 didn't just introduce a more powerful battleship, it reset the standard for naval strength across Europe. Each side justified its expanding fleet as a defensive move, yet interpreted the other's buildup as a threat, fueling a spiral that neither dared to break for fear of falling behind. By 1914, Britain had 29 dreadnoughts in service and under construction, while Germany raced to keep up with 17 of its own. The logic was simple and relentless. Stopping unilaterally could mean ceding the advantage, so budgets climbed and shipyards worked overtime. Today, the pattern persists, but with new technologies and more players. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute reports global military spending hit $2.887 trillion in 2025, the highest figure ever recorded after 11 consecutive years of growth. This surge isn't limited to one region. Europe's defense budgets rose by 14%, Asia and Oceania by 8.1%, while the United States, China, and Russia together accounted for more than half the total. Modern arms competition stretches beyond ships to include hypersonic missiles, cyber capabilities, and nuclear modernization. Each state claims its buildup is a response to insecurity, yet every increase is read as a signal of intent. Arms spending measures capacity, not a blueprint for war, but it shortens the time between suspicion and confrontation. The security dilemma remains. Restraint can look like weakness, and so the race continues. Number 6, a web of entangling alliances transformed local disputes into continent-wide crises in the years before 1914. Austria-Hungary's alignment with Germany and Serbia's close relationship with Russia meant that any conflict in the Balkans was never just a regional affair. Russia's alliance with France stretched the consequences of an eastern dispute all the way to Western Europe, while Britain maintained a mix of strategic and diplomatic commitments that, though not identical to a formal treaty, still shaped its decisions. The Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente formed overlapping groupings, creating a system where no single agreement dictated automatic action, but each commitment increased the risk that a small spark could ignite a much larger fire. The assassination in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction. Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia brought in Russia, whose mobilization plans triggered German intervention, which in turn activated French and British responses. Within weeks, a local crisis had drawn in every major European power. Governments still retained agency, and each decision was debated and contested. But the network of alliances multiplied the consequences of every move, making restraint more difficult with each passing day. Today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization counts 32 member states, each bound by Article 5's promise of collective assistance in the event of an armed attack. While Article 5 requires a political decision and is not an automatic declaration of war, its existence means that crises in one region can quickly become matters for the entire alliance. Similar defense pacts in Asia and the Middle East reinforce this pattern. The mechanism at work is consequence multiplication. Commitments that are meant to deter aggression also make any local incident politically larger, raising the stakes of every confrontation. This is why the web of alliances stands above the arms race and the warning signs of systemic crisis. Number 5. Economic interdependence was widely believed to serve as a brake on conflict, yet history shows its limits when national security and pride are at stake. On the eve of World War I, Britain and Germany were deeply entwined through trade, finance, and investment. British banks held German securities, German ships carried British goods, and cross-channel investments fueled industrial growth. Financial markets had every reason to fear disruption, but the dense web of commercial ties failed to prevent the July crisis from spiraling out of control. The assumption that profitable systems would always override political or military concerns overlooked the power of nationalist sentiment and rigid mobilization plans. Once military timetables were activated, the logic of economic loss was no longer enough to halt escalation. In the present, the United States and China remain locked in a similar pattern of mutual dependence. Despite escalating tariffs and efforts to diversify supply chains, each country remains among the other's largest trading partners. Bilateral trade volumes have exceeded $700 billion in recent years, with U.S. electronics and consumer goods markets closely tied to Chinese manufacturing and China's export surplus heavily reliant on American demand. Many analysts argue that these links make direct conflict unlikely, pointing to the sheer scale of shared economic interests. Yet the very structure of this interdependence creates vulnerabilities. Supply chains can be weaponized, sanctions can disrupt critical sectors, and economic pain may be seen as an acceptable price for security or prestige. The lesson from 1914 remains clear. Trade can restrain leaders, but it cannot reliably prevent war if other pressures outweigh the costs. Economic interdependence is a buffer, not a guarantee. Number 4, regional flashpoints at the intersection of rivalries have always provided the immediate ground on which wider power competitions can erupt. In 1914, the Balkans earned the title of Europe's powder keg, not because of a single event, but because ethnic nationalism, imperial decline, and great power ambitions all converged in the same fragile zone. Serbia's push for self-determination directly challenged Austria-Hungary's authority, while Russia and Germany watched for any shift that might tip the balance. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914 was a violent spark, but the deeper danger lay in the way local disputes could draw in outside powers with conflicting interests and treaty obligations. The resulting crisis was not inevitable, but the structure made escalation likely once a trigger appeared. Today's world features several regions where local disputes overlap with the interests of major powers. In Eastern Europe, the ongoing war in Ukraine involves not just Russia and Ukraine, but NATO's eastern flank and the credibility of collective defense. The Taiwan Strait stands as another flashpoint, where China's territorial claims confront U.S. security commitments and the economic stakes of global supply chains. On the Korean Peninsula, North Korea's expanding missile and nuclear capabilities have prompted new military postures from the United States, South Korea, and Japan, with China and Russia providing political backing to Pyongyang. In the Middle East, rivalries between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and outside actors like the US, Russia, and China have turned local conflicts into arenas for broader competition, with energy routes and technological partnerships at stake. Each of these flashpoints is unique in its local dynamics, but all share the potential to entangle regional actors with outside powers. The lesson from 1914 is not that any single crisis must escalate, but that the intersection of local disputes and systemic rivalries creates pathways for rapid escalation. Regional flashpoints matter because they are the points where accumulated tensions can collide, turning a contained crisis into a global emergency. Number 3, public and political denial. Until the final weeks reveals how fast a crisis can outpace even the most well-informed leadership. In the summer of 1914, Europe's diplomats and monarchs, many related by blood, exchanged letters and telegrams that reflected routine, even optimism, as the continent edged closer to catastrophe. The timeline tightens dramatically after June 28th, the day of the Sarajevo assassination, but the real compression begins with Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd. Serbia's reply followed on July 25th, and by July 28th, Austria-Hungary had declared war. Within days, Russia's partial and then full mobilization triggered German declarations of war on Russia and France, and Germany's move against Belgium brought Britain into the conflict on August 4th. What stands out is not only the sequence of decisions, but the shrinking window for negotiation. Railway timetables and preset military plans forced each power to act quickly, making mobilization itself appear as a signal of intent. Once the machinery was set in motion, diplomacy was squeezed into ever narrower channels, often reduced to last-minute telegrams between leaders like the famous Wilhelm Nicke correspondence. Historians have traced how the pace of these moves, measured in hours and days rather than weeks, caught even experienced statesmen off guard. In modern times, the speed of crisis has only increased. Cyber operations, missile alerts, rapid military deployments, and economic coercion can all unfold in minutes or hours, compressing the space for deliberation and response. While today's crises may not follow the same railway timetables, the risk remains that a regional flashpoint could escalate before leaders fully grasp the consequences. The lesson from 1914 is that denial and delay can make escalation automatic, not because leaders want war, but because the system's speed leaves little room for second thoughts. Coming to the top three, the nuclear and institutional counter-argument stands as the most substantial challenge to any direct comparison between the world of 1914 and the present. Nuclear weapons have fundamentally altered the logic of great power war. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, first formalized in the 1960s by theorists such as Thomas Schelling, holds that any full-scale conflict between nuclear-armed states would bring devastation on a scale that makes victory meaningless. This deterrent effect depends on more than just the existence of arsenals. It requires survivable second strike forces, credible communication between rivals, rational decision-making under pressure, and robust safeguards to prevent accidental or unauthorized launches. The presence of nuclear weapons has not ended military competition, but it has raised the threshold for direct confrontation between major powers to a level unknown in 1914. Institutions also mark a decisive break with the pre-World War I system. The United Nations, established in 1945, provides a standing diplomatic forum and a Security Council with the authority to address international crises before they escalate. In theory, these mechanisms offer off-ramps that did not exist in the July crisis, when European capitals relied on bilateral telegrams and last-minute appeals. Yet the effectiveness of these institutions is not guaranteed. The Security Council's veto power often leads to paralysis when the interests of major powers collide, as seen in recent deadlocks over Ukraine, Syria, and other flashpoints. Political division, proxy conflict, and coercive diplomacy can bypass or undermine institutional channels, leaving dangerous gaps in the crisis management architecture. Scholars remain divided on how much weight to give these modern constraints. Some point to the absence of direct war between nuclear-armed great powers since 1945 as evidence that deterrence and institutions work. Others warn that the risk of miscalculation, escalation through proxy wars, and the erosion of arms control agreements may erode these safeguards. The analogy to 1914 is not a prediction but a pattern, one that highlights how quickly a system can shift from stability to crisis when underlying pressures mount. The real test is whether leaders and publics are vigilant enough to recognize warning signs before familiar assumptions fail. The outbreak of World War I was not the result of a single event or isolated miscalculation. Instead, the disaster emerged from a web of interacting pressures: rival power centers, surging nationalism, relentless arms competition, rigid alliances, economic overconfidence, regional flashpoints, and a shrinking window for diplomatic response. Each condition, considered separately, might have seemed manageable to leaders in 1914, but together they created a system where compromise became expensive, delay felt dangerous, and local crises could spiral into continent-wide catastrophe. The assassination in Sarajevo did not cause the war on its own. It triggered a network of pre-existing risks, each magnifying the others and narrowing the choices available to policymakers. In the summer of 1914, European elites made rational arguments for why escalation was unlikely, pointing to economic ties, diplomatic relationships, and the deterrent effect of alliances. Yet these factors did not neutralize each other. Instead, their interaction made the system brittle and unpredictable, setting the stage for escalation. Today, analysts see a similar stack of overlapping pressures. The United States and China compete across military, economic, and technological domains. Russia's confrontation with the West in Ukraine and its efforts to influence neighboring states add to the tension. Regional powers in the Middle East and Asia pursue their own agendas, sometimes clashing with larger blocs. Global military spending reached $2.887 trillion in 2025, marking an 11th straight year of growth. Trade networks remain dense, but supply chains are increasingly used as tools of leverage, and economic coercion has become a regular part of statecraft. Flashpoints in Eastern Europe, the Taiwan Strait, the Korean Peninsula, and the Middle East sit at the crossroads of great power rivalry and local grievances. Each of these factors can be measured, but it is their interaction, the way they reinforce or constrain one another, that raises the stakes. Claims that this is the first such convergence since 1914 must be traced to specific analysts and checked against recent research from sources like SIPRI, NATO, and the United Nations. Some scholars argue the current stack is historically unique, while others point to nuclear deterrence and international institutions as key differences from the past. Yet arms control agreements are eroding, and the Security Council often stalls in the face of great power vetoes. The real diagnostic question is whether leaders monitor how these risks interact and accelerate, not just their individual presence. The warning is not about predicting an identical war, but about recognizing how compounding pressures can overwhelm even the strongest safeguards. Across all 10 warning signs, one pattern stands out. History's most dangerous moments emerge when interlocking pressures build beneath a surface of denial. Today's safeguards, nuclear deterrence, and global institutions offer real barriers, but their limits are tested by speed, complexity, and human error. The analogy to 1914 isn't destiny, it's a warning framework. What matters now is vigilance. Are we recognizing the convergence of risks before they outrun control? Comment which warning sign worries you most, and subscribe for more historical deep dives.